to all of you in the third episode of the webinar for the month of March. This episode is about the teaching science environment and health towards a new pedagogy. Dear audience, I hope you will respect the protocols of the webinar. Please use the chat box for your questions and the comments. This webinar is being presented and recording through live stream that you can find through the sources of social media of University of Education. Dear audience, I'm delighted to introduce you with Dr. Justin Diller, speaker of the today webinar. Dr. Dillon is a professor of science, environmental education, and a director of the Center for Research in STEM Education at Exeter University, UK. During his 26 years in teaching, he has been involved in a number of research and development projects working with schools, museums, science centers, aquarium, and botanic gardens. He has been working as a president of the European Association for Research in Science Education from 2007 to 2011. And currently, he is working as a president for the National Association for Environmental Education as a trustee of the Council for Learning Outside the Classroom. He has significant contribution in the first ever International Handbook on Research in Environmental Education. Dear audience, as you know, COVID-19 pandemic has forced sudden transformation in many sectors of the global community, turning the world upside down. Everything has been impacted and not included the education sector, which has experienced more unforeseen changes in many parts of the world. The sudden transition to online pedagogy as a result of COVID-19 in developing countries has exposed some inequalities and the challenges and as well as benefits. These challenges and inequalities have now become the new realities in the educational sector of developing countries. Our today's session will give us information about the transformative change of teaching science with the new pedagogy. So let's start our session and welcome to Dr. Justin. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Sadia, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I recognise one or two names from the University of Education, so it's good to see you. There's Anwar. Hello. Good to see you.
How are you, Justin?
I hope you're well.
Yeah, well, I'm fine, thank you.
I'm going to share my slides, but I just wanted to start off with a little bit of extra background. I trained as a science teacher, and I taught in schools in London for 10 years before becoming an academic, and a lot of my time I've spent training teachers as well. We've got at Exeter we have a very large pre-service course, and so I spend a lot of my time teaching on that. And I also teach on master's programs and doctoral programs. And I visited Pakistan only once, I'm afraid, and that was for our Department for International Development, looking at environmental education in Pakistan. But I only got as far as Karachi, I'm afraid. My colleague went up into the mountains, and I hope one day to visit Pakistan again. It's been way too long. This sort of session is about the idea of transformative education, and I think my thinking has been catalysed really by and provoked by the pandemic, as well as by the long-standing challenge of climate change. And it strikes me that it really is time to have a radical rethink of the relationship between science education, health education, and environmental education. And we have to move towards an education approach which is quite radically different, I think, than what we have now. and one which is it is genuinely transformative in that it will encourage people to take a greater control over their lives and to have more beneficial impacts on the environment and to look after themselves, to make themselves more healthy. But that's not going to be easy. I'm not going to pretend that this is I'm offering an easy solution. I'm offering what I hope is just a vision of what might happen, what might be possible, and to encourage other people to have other thoughts or similar thoughts, whatever, just to raise some issues, because not many people, I think, are raising them at the moment, and I think that's a problem. We seem to be stuck with the same old science education that we've had for a long time. So I'm going to I'll sort of pause halfway through for some questions and discussion, but I will just start with this slide. So, it's just I was at the wrong end. So yes, so I've talking about with some colleagues who I've will show you later on, come up with this idea for science, environment, health as a new pedagogical approach, and that line between the words science and environment and health really should indicate a sort of a permeable, semi-permeable membrane, really, rather than a barrier. But I couldn't find anything that was better than that. It's meant to show that there's some movement and some overlap, and I'll show you how much overlap I think there should be later on. So my opening argument really is that science education as we know it has failed. And what's happened is because of a lack of basic scientific knowledge and a lack of understanding of how scientists work, of how vaccination works, about how disease is transmitted. That's resulted in hundreds of thousands, millions of deaths throughout the world recently. That's on top of the deaths from climate change or other large-scale environmental and health issues. There are still, in 2021, far too many people who believe all sorts of conspiracy theories rather than believing scientists and science teachers. And that, I think, has led to, again, a sort of major problems, particularly in some countries more than others. And I think if we've been arguing that we've been trying to promote scientific literacy for years, then I think we haven't got the evidence to say that we have a scientifically literate population. And I think we should have a rethink, not just about the curriculum, but about the pedagogy, in order to come up with an education that people are more likely to trust than not. So what might that new pedagogy look like? I'm going to start off by pointing you towards a freely available online article in this Journal for Activist Science and Technology Education, edited by a couple of friends of mine, Steve Alsop and Larry Bentz. It's a very interesting journal from the University of Toronto, and I thoroughly commend it to you. And I volunteered to write a paper halfway through last year with a colleague, Lucy, who's from the Netherlands. She's from Cyprus originally, and I worked with her in London. And Lucy and I have written this paper where we ask a series of questions for the science education community in this particular case. I'll go through each question in more detail, but those are the 7 questions. One is about the curriculum, one is about science education itself and what we've learned from being online, one's about science education research, One's about our own work and practices. One's about the ethics and politics of social distancing. And then there's a sort of question about pedagogy and a question at the end about business and industry. So these are a set of global questions for the science education community. So question one, how well has the curriculum prepared us, the world's population? And I think the answer is probably a resounding no. It hasn't done it very well at all, really. There are far too many examples I could point to, hundreds of examples of people who are actively doubting and sabotaging attempts to spread the vaccine. There are all sorts of myths and misunderstandings which are being deliberately spread by people, which has it's in some of these conspiracy theories are might be amusing, but these ones are dangerous. And I think all the people who spread these conspiracies will have had science education for quite some time. They've chosen not to believe it. They've chosen to believe other sources of information. And that's because we haven't convinced people of the value of science and the rigour of science, scientific work, and given people a direct experience to show them why they should trust science and scientists. And there's a whole series of conspiracy theories, from the people not believing that we landed on the moon, people believing the Earth is flat, people believing that 5G phone masks cause cancer, people believing that the trails you see coming from aircraft are harmful, and then the ones about vaccines. So there's some overlap. If you believe one conspiracy theory, you are more likely to believe others. And in some parts of the world, there's a link between your political opinion and your view of conspiracy theories. But nevertheless, these are all educated people, and they clearly their education has not worked. We need to rethink what we're going to do about it. Just to give some specifics, in Europe, there's different countries have different responses. Some of the Nordic countries, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, are more accepting of vaccination. But a survey done last year showed that almost a quarter of French adults would certainly or probably not get vaccinated. That's a huge sample of people, 5,000 people, and one in four French adults say that they certainly or probably wouldn't get vaccinated. Now, obviously, as more people get vaccinated and as time goes by, more people will change their mind. But even to have a quarter of your population thinking that they wouldn't get vaccinated is quite astonishing for a civilized country. And the main reason that they gave in the survey was they just thought it wasn't safe. Now, there is some. France is a slightly unusual country in this respect because there has traditionally been an anti-vaccine philosophy in France, partly because there was a disaster some years ago when people were vaccinated and it actually caused some major health problems. But there's also a general anti-establishment feel in France at the moment. So different countries have different understandings, I think, of different cultural approaches to this issue. But nevertheless, I think that's an astonishing figure. And I've written in the past with a colleague, Peter Gill, about how we need to talk more about risk and about probability in the science curriculum. And I think that's the case for increasing education about statistics and simple statistics and probability and risk is the case is greater now than it ever has been. And in that article in the School Science Review, we give some examples of what might be done. That paper's about 20 years old now, so the issue clearly hasn't gone away. In terms of the UK, we've got maybe about 14% of an enormous sample of respondents to a survey saying they were unwilling, while 23% were unsure. So that's 37%. That's over a third of the population unsure or unwilling. And this survey went into more details and found more facts. Found more factors as to what may be behind. So what correlations there are with other factors. The poorer people are, the lower their income, the less likely they are to be positive about vaccination. Those people who didn't have a flu vaccine last year are more likely to resist vaccination. And those who are not following the government advice, women in particular, and those living with families, living with children, all those factors are associated with an unwillingness to receive the vaccine. So this is a sort of social justice issue. It's the poorer people. There's a gendered aspect to it. It's not necessarily a political issue in the UK. And it's people living with families. So this is why I think our call for a change in the education system has a background in transforming society, because clearly it's the poorest and often the minority populations who are suffering more from this lack of an adequate education. This happened during the early days of the pandemic in the UK. This shows that people, all these people are educated people. They've all been to school for 11 years or so. But here they are taking in the sun on the beach, on the seaside, and the picture is foreshortened, so the people aren't quite as close as it looks like. But nevertheless, people are taking an enormous risk from being in a situation like this. People don't understand risk. They don't understand how diseases are transmitted, and they don't understand the need for people to look after themselves. So even if you don't get it yourself, you're likely to spread it to other people. So there's this basic lack of understanding of issues. We've even had the government paying for advertisements to show us how to wash our hands. So after 11 years of education, if we still have to have a government video showing us how to wash our hands, something's gone seriously wrong. So the answer to that question was that current science education hasn't prepared us very well. The second question was about whether we should go back after the pandemic is finished, whether we should carry on doing things online. This is my pre-service teachers. Some of my pre-service teachers, they're in perspex boxes, effectively, keeping them away from each other and away from me. I have my face shield on, and I keep a 2-meter distance from them. Is this actually better than online educators face to face? Is that better than online education? I think we will probably, having put together a lot of online resources, I suspect in the future that we will carry on doing some online teaching, even if it's referring people to the videos that we've made over the last year or so and saying, watch this and then come in and we'll discuss it. And also today, it would have taken me days to fly to Lahore and days to fly back for a short talk. And actually, it's very easy. I can just have breakfast, turn on the computer, talk with you, have a discussion, and people from all over the world could join in. There's a lot to be said for online education. It's not the same, but it's the damage to the environment is far less doing things this way. So I think the pandemic has made us have a rethink about how we conduct science education. And as researchers, many of us as science education researchers, are we doing enough to produce knowledge that's protecting society from these catastrophic events? Are we researching the right things? I edit a journal, and I frequently get frustrated when people send in papers when they're researching pre-service teachers' views about this, that, or the other. And finding yet again that pre-service teachers don't seem to know a great deal. I just wonder whether there are better things that we can be researching, interventions to try and create a better, more transformative science education, and just do simple surveys of our own students. Maybe we could try and carry out interventions with these pre-service teachers and try and come up with a better quality, high quality science education. So I think that's a challenge that we face as science education researchers. I've already intimated that our working practices will change. I think there will be fewer people going to conferences. Conferences will be online or blended. It means that wherever you are in the world, you can probably take part in a conference that you may not have been able to. And seminars, our seminar attendance is generally increased because people can just turn on from home. So it's really going to shake up our working practices a great deal. This is a question about social distancing. We're all encouraged to keep a metre and now 2 metres away from each other. This is fine if you're middle class or upper class, working in our living at home or in large houses or wherever, or being able to be driven around. But for most people, this notion of social distancing is impossible to achieve. It's just not feasible. And the health risks, again, are to the people who are poorest, and the ones who are most at risk are the people who have got the least access to health services. So again, the restrictions that people have brought in tend to hit the poorer members of society rather than the richer ones. Talking about pedagogies, this is the main feature, I think, of my what I'm going to talk about is pedagogical approaches. And I think that's set in the context of international comparisons like PISA, the Programme for International Student Assessment, TIMS, Trends in International Maths and Science Study. All these surveys which are used to compare different countries and their education systems are promoting sort of pedagogical approaches which I clearly think are not appropriate, really. And in this article by Svein Sjoberg and Edgar Jenkins, it's open access article, and they are arguing that these international comparisons are actually promoting science education which is not fit for purpose. So I recommend that article. And what's interesting is that the new framework for the PISA tests is being put together now. And there is a strategic vision group which is looking at the science curriculum. And they are arguing for 3 new knowledge areas. And you can see them there: socio-environmental systems and sustainability, which is supporting young people to solve complex interconnected problems, development of scientific knowledge and its misuse, and informatics, artificial intelligence, and so on. Now, this is quite a radical step for PISA to focus on systems thinking and sustainability. And again, it's promoting a kind of transformative approach to education. Second one, looking at how science is used and how it's misused, is again quite a radical departure from the sort of normal things that PISA has been testing in the past. And you can see what it says there. The current organisation of knowledge in PISA is mostly focused on traditional disciplinary framework, lacks the cross-cutting interdisciplinary approaches. But young people, it says, need to be critical consumers of scientific knowledge in an era where it's so readily accessible. So they're arguing, the expert group are arguing for an education which challenges the growth of misconceptions and of climate change denial and pseudoscience. And it'd be interesting to see whether that gets translated into actual PISA framework in 2024. And there's a risk of topics there. So if governments if this does happen and governments continue to be influenced by PISA, it will create a climate where there are opportunities to have a more transformative science and environmental education. And as a pedagogical approach, they're recommending case studies from science to show how the people argued against vaccination many years ago, denying the existence of anthropogenic climate change or arguing for a creationist worldview, and how those arguments, and so teaching people about the ideas and teaching people how the arguments against them came up, and teaching people the correct scientific consensus view of these issues. And that again would be quite a different pedagogy than is currently found in many schools. People have been trying to get climate change into the curriculum. It's in the curriculum in some countries. In the UK, we had a curriculum revision in 2014, and there was a big push to get climate change into the curriculum, and that push was rejected by the man in charge of the curriculum revision because he said science should just be just about science. It shouldn't have the value. The science curriculum should just be about science and not have the values or the issues in it. He said people can teach about these issues, people can teach about climate change, and they should teach about climate change. But actually in the curriculum, it's not going to be there. Well, of course, what happens is if things are in the curriculum, then they get into the exam system, and if they're in the exam system, then teachers will teach to the test. They won't teach outside the test, and so teachers have rarely been teaching about climate change in an effective way. So now we are in a situation where there is a greater push to get climate change into the curriculum and sustainability. The final question we asked was what role should business and industry play in providing money for science education, research and development. I've benefited myself from funding from British Petroleum, so I'm in two minds really. I can see great value in having industry take part in funding science education, because the government often doesn't provide enough money for innovation. But I also see that there are risks, and I think those risks at the moment might be greater than the benefits. So I'm cautious of the involvement of industry and business in curriculum reform. And that goes to agencies like Pearson. I was involved with Pearson in Saudi Arabia, and the people I worked with were very well-meaning and very good science educators. But you always wonder really what the long-term benefit is for Pearson of being involved in science education reform. We are interestingly entering or in the middle of a phase of our culture where scientists are very high priority. On the top left, you can see our current Prime Minister, flanked by two scientists who become well-known figures. And we are facing a situation where politicians are trying to balance science and politics. That's just almost a bizarre idea that you have to balance scientific knowledge with political realpolitik, if you like. Interesting, the bottom left is the New Zealand Ashley Bloomfield, who's a civil servant. He's the man who promotes and talks about the pandemic on TV. He's become a national hero and has his own fan club. So scientists are very high profile, very high status at the moment, and we need to sort of make use of that and come up with. It's a teachable moment. I mean, we need to think of how can we give people more access to a broader range of scientists. Most of the scientists who appear on the TV in the pandemic briefings are male, and so that's an issue. This is a report which has been looking at this thing about how the British people have been responding to the science information and asked their opinion about scientific knowledge and about the data that's being produced. And the survey, quite a large survey of people, said virtually everybody thought that the COVID-19 data, the scientific data, should be openly available for people to check, so it's transparent. 2/3 of people thought the data should be available for anyone to use. 2/3 are now more likely to listen to expert advice from qualified scientists, which is a good thing. 3 in 10 people think that restricting the public's right to information is a necessary emergency measure, so people are reluctant to, most people are reluctant to accept restrictions on the public's right for information. And almost 2/3 of people think a government data strategy would have helped in the fight against COVID-19. So there's lots of good signs there for scientists and science educators, in that people are valuing science and scientific information. So maybe that's some good that will come out of this situation. This is a tracking survey from the British Science Association, and they've, over a long period of time, they've asked a question. They've asked me to respond to the statement, modern science does more harm than good. And you can see back in 1993 that the responses were pretty similar, although far more people, a lot of people disagreed. That disagreement with that statement has increased over time, and the number of people agreeing has gone down to 10%. So this is, again, a sign, I think, that maybe we're heading in the right direction. It's just that we haven't really gone far enough, and it's taken a pandemic for people to sort of re-evaluate their position on science education. Back in 2014, together with 3 colleagues, one from the Netherlands, one from Australia, one from the US, we wrote about how science education and environmental education need to come closer together. And this paper was in Science, the Journal of Science. And we said that these urgent, what we call these wicked problems that won't go away, like biodiversity loss, climate change, food security, which are complex and contested, needs environmental educators and science educators to work together rather than to work in separate silos. And we said, look, the situation, and this is still true now, 7 years later, science education focuses primarily on the knowledge and skills, environmental education stresses values and changing behaviours, and the relationship between the two has been described as competitive and host-parasite. And we were arguing that people should work together in a whole school approach to sustainability and eco-schools, where different forms of learning blend, using information technology, citizen science, community engagement, and that would involve a redesigning of school grounds, giving more place in the curriculum for health and food and ecology, as well as using environmental education to bring together local politicians, schools, scientists, the public, to work together on environmental issues. And we call that approach a civic science approach. Since then, I think the growing popularity and growing reference to the Sustainable Development Goals is again promoting people to rethink education. And you can see that in many of these, science education, environmental education, health education, all have a role to play in achieving many of these Sustainable Development Goals. So my argument is that we do need more scientific literacy to face today's problems. We need a different kind of scientific literacy. We also need environmental literacy and health literacy. And we also need to recognise the value of the arts and humanities more than we do at the moment. So I'm going to pause there for questions and comments and see if there's anybody who would like to ask a question or make a comment. We've got time to discuss them, I think.
Theologians, if you have any question, you can directly ask to Dr. Justin Dillon, or you can write your question in the chat box.
Yes, Justin, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. I just have 2 point of views. The discussion which you have just shared with us. One, you have pointed out that if we are adding the environmental curriculum formally in our classes, so there is a chance that teachers might just taught those subjects for the sake of formal assessments. So instead of making it a formal part of the curriculum, it's always useful to analyze or to examine the pedagogies which teacher educators or science teachers are using in the classroom. So, what do you advise? How can we make the teachers responsible in a way that they are going to educate our students in a practical way through their pedagogies, that their behavior, that the teachers can, positively influence their students' behavior in terms of changing the environment in which they live. So, what are your experiences in terms of teachers' pedagogy related to environmental education?
Sure. Well, thank you, Naima. That's a very good question. Because it's, I'm going to talk about that in the second part of my talk. But I think there is an issue. There has to be some top-down directive from government, I think, supported by public opinion, that schools should be doing more to promote sustainability and environment in the curriculum. There has to be opportunities for children to get credit for the work they do in the sustainability era, and that's not just by having an exam. People need to be, we need to broaden the ways in which we do assessment so that schools and individuals get rewarded for their contribution and their understanding. And teachers themselves need professional development and need to be encouraged and given examples. You can't just tinker with one bit of the system. You've got to address, this is a systemic change that we're looking at, whereby we need to rethink how we assess, we need to rethink the curriculum, and we need to give teachers more effective pedagogic tools. The good news is that there are many examples of where this has been done, and I'll show you some of those in the second part of my talk. So you had a second question, I think, Naima, was that right?
Yes, Justin, thank you so much. My second question was also related to your comment, which you have made, that instead of encouraging our students to research on pre-service teachers' conceptual understanding about environmental education, we should do more practical research, more action research type of projects. But Sadia might agree with me that in Pakistani universities we do not have that culture of doing any intervention. If we want to plan any intervention, there is so much bureaucratic procedures involved that we cannot meet the outline, the timelines which are given. And the students and the teachers, I mean the supervisors, they are so discouraged that they don't opt for any action research, that they don't opt for any practical project. So I don't know what's the scenario or the context in UK, but this is what I do have experience in Pakistani context. Sadia might agree with me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate the problem, and I think it's probably you are not alone in Pakistan in having that issue. I think that change will happen if people try and push for change and try and find ways in which these things. There are always ways to get things done if over time. I think things may well change if there's pressure on to change, if there are opportunities to experiment, if you can find local people who will support that change, or policymakers, politicians, education department, education ministry, people who might support change. But you're right. I mean, I'm not underestimating the inertia in the system. But we are living in a climate. Many countries and many institutions have declared a climate and environment emergency. In order to deal with that emergency, people have to start taking quite radical action. So I would be hopeful. I think all you can do, I think, is to be optimistic and hopeful that change will come, and try and find a way for that change to happen, to support that change if it comes. But as I say, I'm not underestimating the difficulties that you may well be facing.
Thank you.
And if you can do things in collaboration with universities elsewhere and take part in projects, even as sort of observers, if you like, or silent partners, working in collaboration with people in other countries, where you can develop the skills and appreciate the strategies, and that will give you the sort of confidence to sort of think, well, I can see that this can be done.
Yeah, there is a big gap in Pakistan in terms of university partnership with the school academia. Regarding the intervention, Dr. Justin, can you please explain a little bit what sort of interventions we can consider in the context of Pakistan to promote science education?
Yeah, again, you're restricted by the examination system, I think. But
Yeah.
I think if you find out that your pre-service students don't know a great deal about a particular topic, then it's a matter of trying to change the curriculum and change their change the materials or the approaches that you use, so that you try and address those gaps in people's knowledge. Most of the research that I've seen of pre-service teachers shows that people gives a deficit model. They don't know about this and they don't know about that. Well, if they don't know about things, we have to find a way to give them that knowledge, whether that means it's independent study for them or projects, or actually trying to practice things in the classroom. But we have to find a way to give them opportunity, to incentivize them to improve their knowledge and their teaching skills, so that they not just will not know more. So not just that they will know more, but when they go into the classroom, they'll be able to teach more effectively. And that's that's challenging, because of the pressure that there's never enough time in a teacher education course to teach people what you want. But you have to give people some hope. And if they're spending all their time doing surveys, finding out they don't know much, then maybe they could be spending some time boosting their knowledge and boosting their skills and confidence in teaching things which are appropriate. There will always be some students in any cohort who are more capable, more willing, more adventurous than others, and it's maybe finding those and working with those to come up with new approaches which they can use in the classroom. If you're a trainee teacher, once you see something works in the classroom, you are more likely to take it on board, and you're more likely to sort of change your practice to accommodate the new way of teaching. If someone just tells you about something and it doesn't seem to work, then you'll never pick it up. Okay, so I promised you I would show you some pedagogical approaches. So I'm just going to go back to presenting. Okay, and here we go. So in terms of this new approach, I just want to acknowledge that two people, Albert Zaya and Regular Kaibert Graber from Austria, who organised a conference in 2009, where a lot of people got together and talked about issues of science and environment and health education. And from that, there emerged this book, which is the conference proceedings, and from that book grew a special interest group in the European Science Education Research Association. And then there was a special issue which Albert and I did of the International Journal, and so this movement has grown. And the latest online paper, I think, on this is in the journal Disciplinary and Interdisciplinary Science Education Research, which comes out of Beijing Normal University. So again, that's an open access. If you want to know more, there's an open access paper to look at. In general, if you look at the overlap between science, environment and health in the traditional curriculum, in the UK or elsewhere, it looks a bit like that. There are bits of overlap. And what we're arguing is there should be far more fundamental overlap, so that every topic you teach, there should be some reference to the environment and some reference to health. And that triumvirate of ways of thinking about the world will lead to richer, more effective, transformative education. We think it says that it's a science for all strategy that might foster motivation, particularly amongst girls, and there's a rationale for that statement in that paper. So that's the particular statement I would draw your attention to. It's about broadening the relevance of the curriculum through a range of pedagogies. So, for example, if you teach about digestion, traditionally you might teach about digestion and biology, but if you could then talk about sustainable food and the impact of different kinds of quality of food, the value of sustainable food in improving people's health. If you talk about plant structure, you could also talk about the role of plants in society and how the commercial aspect of plant growing and the relationship between plants and the food that we eat. And then if you talk about physiology, you might talk about physical and mental well-being as well as just talking about the basic mechanics of physiology. So any topic you take, we think that you can adapt and bring an environmental and health dimension. And that would require quite a radical rethink, but as we know from our own practice, can be very exciting. And there's substantial evidence that the impact, the growing knowledge about the impact of nature on our well-being. People who have access to the nature, whether it's for a short period each day or even a longer period, tend to be healthier mentally and physically. And so, it is why it's increasingly important to get people to come into contact more with nature and to develop a sense of that they can contribute to improving the quality of the environment. Here's one study. It says a 2-hour dose of nature significantly boosts health and well-being. And there's lots of examples. It's a bit of maybe it's a sort of simplistic correlation or association, but there is, if you've got the time to spend 2 hours outside, you're probably in a position where you have a bit more freedom and control over your life anyway. But nevertheless, it seems to be that we have a natural desire, many of us, to spend time in the outdoors because it helps to regenerate and to reinvigorate. So, this is some material from the US National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, the NIH, and some education materials. Again, these are freely available. How you might take a science, environment, health approach to climate change. Because climate change, you might think, well, teaching about climate change is about science and atmospheric science and so on. But in fact, climate change has a whole range of impacts, health impacts. So, for example, between 2030 and 2050, we know that climate change is expected to cause 250,000 additional deaths from malnutrition, malaria, diarrhea, and heat stress. And there's all sorts of examples where climate change and health are increasingly being linked together. So you can't teach climate change and environment education without teaching about health education. And climate change affects a whole range of things: clean air, safe drinking water, food, and secure shelter. And that report is that's one's freely available, and I recommend you to have a look at it. It's got lots of useful information. So it has 9 chapters, all of which are rich with information and things that you can use in your teaching to show the link between science, environment, and health. For example, there are children who are particularly at risk from the aftermath of extreme events like tsunamis or forest fires. They're the ones who suffer most anxiety, most mental health. So climate change particularly is going to affect their physical and mental health of young children. Indigenous populations in many parts of the world are what tend to suffer more because they are less resilient financially and environmentally to climate change or other environmental issues. So again, these are social justice issues. And it's fish stocks, particularly indigenous populations, are linked to growing food or harvesting fish in this case, and they are the ones who might suffer most from sea level rise or rising sea temperatures or whatever. So it is this issue of social justice. In the US, particularly, 4.5 million cases of worsened asthma linked to forest fires. Those forest fires are linked to climate change, and we can already see that almost 7 million children are suffering from asthma in the US, making it a chronic disease of childhood, and that number is likely to increase
with the growing number of forest fires across the US, which you've seen last year and the year before. So here's some examples. They asked for some examples of this is actually in California. It's the edible schoolyard. It was the first sort of example of where schools started growing food. And this is the Martin Luther King Junior School, I think it is. And people started growing food back in the 90s, I think it was. And this was quite a radical thing to happen. It was getting kids outside in the school grounds. It's not every school has grounds as good as this, but the kids would grow things, a whole range of different crops and foodstuffs. They would then take it back into this specially built room where they could cook and analyse the food and the meals and whatever. And this is a wonderful resource. And these are now increasingly common across the world, this ability to link together growing crops, food, and health. There's even a periodic table of the vegetables, which you can get online to show, to sort of make people think differently about the role and value of vegetables. This is in the UK. People growing cabbages for their, which they then would harvest and cook in the school kitchen. So it's showing, because many kids don't understand where their food comes from. And this is from a friend of mine, Michael Holland, who used to work at the Chelsea Physics Garden, and he realised that children didn't have good examples didn't have a good understanding of where their food came from. So he said, well, okay, let's start a project where we grow foodstuffs and plants in the food container that where there's an obvious link. So he's growing tomatoes in a tomato can, growing corn in a cereal packet, growing apples, apple seeds and apple thing. Just so, and he has about 80 or 90 of these now. And it's a simple idea, simple pedagogy technique, and people begin to realise that, yes, actually, our food comes from plants. Virtually all the food we eat has in some way come from plants, whether it's meat from animals which have fed on grass or whatever. All our food comes from plants. So I said not all schools have big school grounds. So this is a school in East London, a primary school, an elementary school, and these happy smiling children are having a garden club, and the garden has been created from planters put down and filled with soil. So it was an empty school playground and has now been transformed into a garden with quite a small amount of money. And again, it just brightens up the lives of these students and gives them a realisation that plants have value to us in all sorts of ways. The eco school, the green school movement, this is some visit I went to China many years ago, has really taken off. There are hundreds of thousands of kids who go to green or eco schools, and I would hope all schools would learn from this and would take on board this whole school approach. It goes back to this question of what can be done. A whole school approach is far, far more effective than just an individual teacher trying to battle against their authorities. Whole school approaches supported by NGOs, by government, are transformative for people's lives and give the right sort of message over a sustained period of time. And fortunately, they give examples, I think, of just what can be done. And finally, I might just look at this. So I went to China recently, and this is a Chinese elementary school. They've got their own greenhouse. They're very close to the Chinese Academy of Sciences botanic gardens. So they've got lots of help from local scientists. But inside, you've got a pond with a good interpretation. That's the director of the school in the middle. They grow things, they grow crops, and they harvest them. The work on the school shows this link between environment and science. They have active recycling, and I think it's this whole school approach. And really, in this case, it was down to the school leader. It was down to this person here, supported by her staff. If you find transformative individuals, they can do an enormous amount to improve the direction in which a school travels. So I think that's the optimistic note on which I would, having started off by saying science education has failed, I think it's possible to show how in some parts of the world some schools are really addressing these issues head on and having great success. But sorry about the noise, that's some of my neighbours having some work done by the sound of it. The slides are available. I think the session will be recorded, so I'll stop presenting and time to wrap up, I think.
Yeah.
One quick question, maybe?
Yeah, but dear audience, if you have any question, so please let me know because we are running short of time, please. You can write your question in the chat box or you can directly ask question from Dr. Justin Dillon. Well, I have a question, Dr. Justin. What is the most suitable pedagogy as a result of your experiences while teaching science to students?
I think the most effective pedagogies are those that encourage children to actually take action, as well as just learning some knowledge, those in which it allows them to the transformative approaches to school grounds and school gardening, when children are actually eating the food that they have grown, it has a huge impact on their understanding, but also on their attitudes towards food. We know that children who grow their own food are more likely to eat a broader range of vegetables than those kids who don't. So actually, not all vegetables, there's some vegetables that no matter how much you grow, you still people that still don't like them apparently. But it gives you a good example that once people understand where food comes from, they are more open to trying different kinds of foodstuffs. Okay, well, I'm going to put my email into the chat, so if anybody wants to email me afterwards, you are very welcome. And
Okay, my next question, how this pandemic has affected in terms of the discovery of new knowledge, particularly in the science disciplines?
Well, yes, I mean, there's going to be huge investment in medical and vaccine science. I can imagine a bit like the forensic science boom some years ago. We're going to get everybody wanting to be, working vaccination, become epidemiologists and whatever. So I think that's going to have an impact. I worry that money is going to be diverted from other things, such as cancer research. But I think that the science has proved its value to the world in ways which are even greater than people knew some years ago. So I think that's a positive thing for science, but also risky in that it might have an impact on how funding is appropriated and spread between the different sciences. Some sciences may actually lose out in the long term.
Okay, I have a last question.
Okay.
Yeah, how developing countries such as Pakistan and it can discover the ways as a new pedagogy to teach science in the schools. You know, we have a learning crisis in the public schools, the learning interaction. So how we can overcome this learning loss?
I think I don't know your context well enough. It's a long time since I've been, but I think there may well be educational charities, maybe philanthropic organisations prepared to put in money for experimentation. Things might have to be done out of school rather than in school because of the pressures of the curriculum. But you need to find those sympathetic, more radical policymakers and education civil servants who might be prepared to encourage change. But I realise how that might be maybe too optimistic.
Okay, thank you so much on behalf of University of Education. Thank you so much for accepting my invitation and conducting a terrific session regarding the transformative pedagogies to teach science. Thank you for sharing the useful ways to modify the teaching practices according to the needs of the learner while giving them information about the science content. Thank you so much, Dr. Justin.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for listening, and I will hope to see you sometime in the future.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, everybody.
Okay, thanks, Justin. Bye bye.
Thank you, everyone, for joining this webinar. Thank you.